Hello. Today I'm going to talk about a dimension of the Civil War that's often left out of our textbooks and popular memory: Mexican and Mexican American soldiers who fought on both sides of the American Civil War. When we think about the Civil War, we typically picture armies of white Union and Confederate soldiers, but this generalization has erased the stories of thousands of other Americans who fought in this war, including Mexicans and Mexican Americans, particularly in the Southwest. Previous Civil War history focused mainly on white soldiers from both sides, completely ignoring the important stories of other ethnic groups involved in the war. States like New Mexico and Texas saw large numbers of Mexican and Mexican American volunteers, and their participation reveals social and racial complexities that challenge our conventional understanding of the war. Secession and the Civil War deeply divided Mexican Americans as much as it did white Americans. This wasn't a simple choice. Accusations of disloyalty before the war resulted in a reluctance by many of them to become involved in the war at all. Historian Jerry D. Thompson's book, Vaqueros in Blue and Gray, has been essential in my research, along with primary sources like the official records of the Union and Confederate armies. My argument today is this: the American Civil War forced Mexicans and Mexican Americans into an impossible position. They had to navigate intense racial prejudice and mistreatment while choosing where their loyalties lied. Their experiences reveal how the war shaped Mexican American identity, culture, and the ongoing struggle for citizenship in the United States. Here I have put together a very brief timeline of the American Civil War as it pertains to Mexicans and Mexican Americans. For the sake of time and to keep things simple, it starts in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, when Mexicans in newly annexed U.S. territories became citizens. When Mexico ceded vast territories to the United States after the Mexican-American War, Mexicans living in those lands were technically granted U.S. citizenship. On paper, they were Mexicans with all the rights implied, but citizenship on paper didn't mean equality. White Americans classified Mexican Americans as inferior and non-white. This led to Mexican Americans facing systematic discrimination despite their legal citizenship status. To put this into perspective, they were unwelcome into their own homeland where they were born and raised. They had limited political rights, economic opportunities, and militia roles. There was also a significant cultural divide between Tejanos in Texas, who had somewhat integrated into Southern society, and New Mexico communities, who kept more distance from white American settlers. So from the very beginning, there was a contradiction and complexity: legal citizenship without social equality. In the years following the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and just before the Civil War, Mexican Americans experienced widespread land theft, which the treaty promised to protect existing Mexican land grants, but Article 10 ensuring this was removed by the U.S. Senate. Through legal manipulation and fraudulent claims, white American settlers used the U.S. legal system, which required English language documentation and expensive lawyers, to contest Mexican land. Many families lost land they had owned for generations. People who had been landowners were forced to be laborers on their own property. By the mid 1850s, Mexicans and Tejanos had built a successful business hauling freight using ox carts. They were able to move goods more quickly and cheaper than their white competitors. This led to the Cart War of 1857. Historian David J. Weber notes that they destroyed Mexican ox carts, stole their freight, and killed and wounded a number of Mexican carters. Violence began in July 1857, and local authorities made no serious effort to apprehend the criminals. The violence increased so much that some feared a campaign of death against Mexicans was underway. Public opinion in counties between San Antonio and the coast ran heavily against the Carters, who were regarded as an intolerable nuisance. Even newspapers that opposed the violence showed their racism. The Nueces Valley Weekly of Corpus Christi expressed concern for the Mexicans, stating, "Notwithstanding the fact of their being low in the scale of intelligence." The violence became so severe that the Mexican minister in Washington protested to the U.S. Secretary of State in October of 1857. Texas Governor Alicia M. Pease finally declared, "It is now very evident that there is no security for the lives of citizens of Mexican origin engaged in the business of transportation. along the road from San Antonio to the Gulf. It would not be until he called out the militia with armed escorts before the war subsided in December of 1857. It is important to know that this was ethnic violence, not economic competition. Lynchings and vigilante violence against Mexicans were common throughout South Texas, and there was no legal protection. Local law enforcement and courts offered little help. Then, in 1859, we have the Cortina Rebellion. Juan Cortina, a Mexican landowner, shot a Brownsville marshal who was beating a Mexican servant. This would spark a rebellion where Cortina's forces fought back against Anglo violence. The U.S. Army and Texas Rangers would eventually stop the rebellion, but it showed just how violent the tensions had become. And this was just 1 year before the Civil War started. Mexican Americans also faced political exclusion. Despite citizenship, they encountered voter intimidation, poll taxes, and English language requirements that prevented them from voting or holding office. Very few held political positions, even in majority Mexican counties. There is also deep legal complexity about their racial status and whether or not they were white under U.S. law, with courts being inconsistent. In Texas, they were sometimes classified as white for legal purposes, but treated as non-white socially. This affected everything: marriage laws, property rights, jury service, and whether their testimony was credible in court. So by 1861, Mexican Americans had spent 13 years learning that U.S. citizenship didn't guarantee equality. They had experienced land theft, violence, political exclusion, and legal discrimination. This all leads up to the start of the American Civil War in 1861. When the Civil War broke out, these communities faced an impossible choice. They had been denied equality for 13 years, and now they had to decide which side to support in a war that would tear the nation apart. The decision of whether to fight and for which side wasn't simply about slavery or states' rights. For Mexican Americans, it was about survival, protection of their communities, and a hope that military service might finally earn them the respect and recognition they'd been denied. Some joined the Confederacy, hoping to defend their homeland and gain social legitimacy. Others joined the Union, seeking federal protection and the promise of greater equality. And during the early years of 1861 to 1862, we see the formation of these key units on both sides, with Santos Benavidez' command and Tejano Cavalry companies for the South, and New Mexico Volunteers and the 1st Texas Cavalry and 2nd Texas Regiment for the North. So what happened when they actually served? Starting with those who fought for the Confederacy, Colonel Santos Benavidez, the highest-ranking Mexican American in the Confederate Army. Benavidez rose to command the 33rd Texas Cavalry as a colonel. Amazingly, though his regiment was ill-equipped, frequently without food, and forced to march long journeys across the south of Texas and northern Mexico, the 33rd was never defeated in battle. Colonel Benavidez, along with his two brothers, Refugio and Cristobal, who both became captains in the regiment, compiled what Thompson calls a brilliant record of border defense, and were considered as heroes throughout Texas. The Benavidez brothers defeated anti-Confederate forces commanded by Juan Cortina, yes, the same Cortina from the 1859 rebellion. They invaded northern Mexico on 3 separate occasions in retaliation for Unionist-inspired guerrilla raids into Texas, and they successfully drove off a small Union force that attacked Laredo in March of 1864. So why would Mexican Americans choose to fight for the Confederacy? The motivations were very complex and were often about survival. For many Tejanos, joining the Confederacy was about defending their homeland from what they saw as northern invasion. They wanted to maintain local autonomy and protect their communities. Others hoped that military service would earn them social legitimacy and respect. But here's the reality they faced. Confederate authorities didn't trust them. In the official records, we find reports from Confederate officers that reveal this suspicion. John R. Baylor, writing to Brigadier General Sibley in 1861, stated bluntly that the Mexican population are decidedly north in sentiment and will avail themselves of the first opportunity to rob us or join the enemy. Nothing but a strong force will keep them quiet. Another Confederate officer, W. H. Bruin, reported forcing Mexican citizens in Zapata County to take loyalty oaths to the Confederacy. He wrote, "The time being somewhat short, only 20 came forward, but on election day, all will be required to do so before voting." Despite this suspicion, Mexican American Confederate soldiers served in crucial roles. They were primarily assigned to cavalry units and scouting positions. Their skills as vaqueros, with their expert horsemanship, made them extremely useful. Many served in border patrol units, guarding the Rio Grande and protecting Confederate trade routes with Mexico. According to Jerry D. Thompson, about 30 Tejanos from San Antonio, Eagle Pass, and the Fort Clark area joined Trevanion T. Teal's artillery company, and 31 more joined Charles L. Pyron's company. Both units were part of John R. Baylor's 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles, which marched across the deserts of West Texas to secure the Mesilla Valley. These units were later incorporated into General Henry Hopkins Sibley's Confederate Army of New Mexico and fought bravely at the Battle of Val Verde. Other Mexican Texans from San Antonio served in the 6th Texas Infantry and fought in several major eastern campaigns, including the battles of Chattanooga, Chickamauga, Atlanta, and at Franklin and Nashville during John Bell Hood's disastrous invasion of Tennessee. Two of the better-known Tejanos in the regiment were Antonio Bustillos and Eugenio Navarro. More than 300 Texas Mexicans from Refugio and Bexar counties joined the 8th Texas Infantry. Two companies, commanded by Joseph M. Peñazola and Jose Angel Navarro, were almost entirely Tejano. The 8th Infantry included several Mexican Texans who participated in the repulse of Union forces at the Battle of Corpus Christi in August of 1862. Others who served the Confederacy included Manuel Yeturi, a Kentucky teacher and scholar who rose to captain in the 3rd Texas Infantry, and Lieutenant Joseph de la Garza from San Antonio. Some Mexican Americans even served far from home. A few who enlisted in Hood's Texas Brigade marched off to Virginia to see action at major battles: Gaines' Mill, Second Bull Run, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, and ultimately Appomattox Courthouse. In total, at least 2,500 Mexican Texans served the Confederacy, a significant contribution that has been largely forgotten. Despite their service and sacrifice, Mexican-American Confederates faced constant discrimination from white officers and enlisted men. They frequently encountered racism and distrust, were denied advancement opportunities, and were subject to racial slurs. The Confederate government valued their military skills but never viewed them as equals. Yet there were rare moments of recognition. In September 1863, Confederate officer Hamilton P. B. wrote to his superior Edmund P. Turner, stating, "I especially recommend Major Benavides for his untiring energy and patriotism, and would respectfully suggest that the General Commanding recognize officially the distinguished services of Major Benavides and the firm, unyielding support which the companies of Laredo, commanded by Captains Refugio and Cristobal Benavides, all Mexicans, have ever given to our cause." On the Union side, we have figures like Francisco Perea, a wealthy New Mexican who raised a battalion at his own expense. Perea served as lieutenant colonel of a regiment and helped protect New Mexico territory from Confederate invasion. His story shows that some Mexican Americans saw the Union as offering a path toward equality, though, as we'll see, that promise was also complicated and often broken. The Union cause appealed to some Mexican Americans because it represented promises of legal recognition, pay, and stability, federal support, and for some, anti-slavery sentiment. It is important to remember that Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829, so there was some aspect of cultural opposition to the institution of slavery. But for many, the decision was more defensive. Joining the Union offered protection from Confederate reprisals. In border regions, refusing to support the Confederacy could mean violence against your family and community. The Union Army protected some. Thompson notes in his research that many Texans fought not because of some great desire to preserve the Constitution or abolish slavery, but rather to defeat many of their old political enemies in Texas. This is crucial. For many, the Civil War was a continuation of the pre war conflicts I discussed earlier. It was a chance to strike back at the white Americans who had stolen their land and terrorized their communities. The promise of money also helped fill federal ranks, as many from the poorer classes came to the Union. Some were simply just hoping to reach relatives in the North, but didn't have the funds for transportation. The Union offered a way out. Union Mexican Americans served in several key units. These included scouts, conducting border patrol and escort duty, serving as translators between Anglo officers and local populations, and manning frontier posts. The most significant unit was the 2nd Texas Cavalry, commanded by Colonel John L. Haynes. The regiment was composed almost entirely of Tejanos and Mexican nationals recruited from the small villages of the Rio Grande. Company commanders including George Trevino, Clemente Zapata, Cesario Falcon, and Monaco de Abrego. The 1st Texas Cavalry also had substantial Mexican-American participation, as did Pereira's battalion in New Mexico. There were also Union guerrillas operating in the Nueces Strip. The most famous of these were Cecilio Valerio and his son Juan, who fought a bloody skirmish with Confederates at Los Patricos on March 13th of 1864. According to Jerry D. Thompson, in total, about 958 Mexican Texans fought for the Union, roughly one-third of all Mexican Texans who saw action in the war. Most of them served in the 2nd Texas Cavalry, with a large percentage of these men having been born in Mexico. Company records listed about 200 were ignorant of the English language, which tells us about the barriers they faced and why translation services were so important. Captain Adrian J. Vidal's experience in the war shows just how divided and conflicted Mexican Texans were. Vidal originally joined the Confederacy, but deserted and enlisted in the Union Army, only to desert again and join the Liberals in Mexico, where he was captured by the French and executed. His tragic story exemplifies the impossible choices and divided loyalties that the Tejanos faced during this period. Mexican-American soldiers in the Union still faced significant prejudice and serious problems that undermined their service. From the beginning of their enlistment, the 2nd Texas Cavalry had issues. When not on scouting duty, they were often camped near Brownsville in the big bend of the river above town. Thompson describes the health conditions there as appalling. Several men died of pneumonia. The regiment faced racial prejudices and was denied equal pay compared to white soldiers. The Union's failure to keep its promises was also important. The men had not received the clothing they'd been promised and were going around camp almost naked, according to Thompson. They also had not been paid. The inability and unwillingness of the Union Army to pay and clothe the 2nd Regiment seriously limited the number of Mexican Texans willing to join the federal ranks. This led to massive discipline problems and desertion. The 2nd Texas Cavalry suffered a high desertion rate. Union officer Edmund J. Davis complained that Mexican recruits soon become dissatisfied with our manner of making payments and being of Indian blood and nature, the discipline and restraint of this camp, and the value of their horses, arms, and equipment proving too much of a temptation, they take an opportunity to desert and carry them into Mexico. The racism embedded in Davis's explanation attributes their desertion to Indian blood and nature, rather than acknowledging that the Union had broken its promises to these men. In the first 6 months of 1864 alone, more than 200 men deserted from the 2nd Regiment. Even officers like Captain Monaco de Abrego deserted and left to seek refuge in Mexico. Thompson explains another major reason for the high desertion rate was a rumor that the cavalry was about to be transferred to Louisiana. The men had been promised they would only serve in the Texas campaign, not be sent to fight in other states. The regiment fought in the Rio Grande Valley and later in Louisiana, breaking that promise. The lack of discipline in the 2nd Regiment became the talk of the Union Army at Brownsville. Thompson states Union officers Davis and Haynes had hoped to continue recruiting from Mexico, but found their efforts frustrated, admitting that the Mexican recruits have not been as numerous as was expected. So, what does this all mean for how we understand the Civil War and its impact on Mexican American communities? First, let's talk about their exposure to racism. The Civil War was a display of the depths of American racism for the Mexican Americans. Whether they fought for the Union or Confederacy, they encountered systematic discrimination in both armies. Their loyalty was constantly questioned despite their service. White soldiers viewed them as inferior. Their skills were valued, but they were never seen as equals. This racism didn't end with the war. Post war violence and social exclusion continued. Even sacrifice on the battlefield couldn't earn them full acceptance. Second, the struggle for citizenship. Veterans' service didn't guarantee them rights or recognition. They were quickly erased from public memory of the war. The national narrative became white focused and glamorized and made famous generals like Lee and Grant. Mexican American soldiers who had guarded the Rio Grande, protected trade routes, and fought in dozens of engagements were simply written out of the story and ignored. The struggle for pensions and recognition that white veterans received more easily, the question remained, who counts as American? The Civil War exposed that citizenship for Mexican Americans was conditional, something that could be given on paper but denied in practice. Their service was supposed to prove their loyalty and earn them a place in American society. To conclude, the Civil War fundamentally reshaped Mexican American identity. It forced communities to make impossible choices about loyalty, survival, and belonging. It exposed the deep contradictions of U.S. citizenship. You could fight and die for your country and still be treated as an outsider. Their service challenges the white centered narratives we've learned about the Civil War. It wasn't just North versus South. It wasn't just about slavery and states' rights, though those were crucial issues. It's about redefining what counts as American history, whose service matters, and who gets to be remembered. Thank you.